When we think about playing against chord changes, they are usually triads or seventh chords, but all we need are two notes to represent a chord. In some instances, all we need is a melody, because the melody will suggest what the chord changes are. The example I always use is the saxophone player that's playing solo on the street or in a tunnel, or a subway tunnel or something. And if they're good enough, you'll be able to hear the chord changes as they're playing a single line. You can use two notes of every chord and you'll be just fine. That's very common in rhythm guitar playing, where you use two-note chords on adjacent strings. That's all you need in order to play a rhythm part. I do that very frequently on the bass as well. I think if you look at some guitar players, for example, Pat Metheny, I was watching one of his solos yesterday, and for a big part of the solo, he was playing only on the upper two strings. It's very effective, because when you're in a band situation, all the other stuff gets filled out. Another example I always use is called X-formation. It's a variation on information. X-formation is just the essential element of information. So it distills stuff down to its essential elements, and that's all you need, and people get the message from it. And so that's what two-note chords are. So take diatonic chords in a key and use some kind of common chord progression and try to play all those chords on adjacent strings using only two notes. So sometimes you'll leave out the root, sometimes you'll leave out the third, and sometimes you'll leave out the fifth. And it makes complete sense. If you have other instruments that you're playing with, it becomes very orchestral. So if you have two guitars or maybe even three guitars, you shouldn't all be playing the same chord. It's very funny sometimes when I see all these musicians playing on stage, and maybe 5 or 6 guitar players all playing the same chord. But if you thought about that and had all those guitars play different two-note chords in different ranges, it would sound a lot better. So it's something that's very effective in approaching harmony and also understanding harmony, because in order to find out what tones you're leaving out, you have to understand the entire triad. A real simple example on a guitar is just playing a C5, which is C and G at the 3rd and 5th fret on the A and D strings. And then the G chord would be just D and G on the A and D strings at the 5th fret. So there's your 1 and 5 chord right there. For the C chord, you don't need E, and for the G chord, you don't need B. So you're leaving out the thirds. And I think mostly, for the most part, on guitars, I like to leave the thirds out if I can, because thirds are just out of tune just naturally. So it's one of the things that I like about alternate tunings is that it avoids the third in most cases. So my primary standard tuning is Dyads. And Dyads generally uses more fourths and seconds and sixths and ninths. So they tend to avoid the out of tune third. The sixth is out of tune as well, but since it's farther away and the interval is larger, it kind of masks the intonation problems with it. Also on guitar, especially down towards the nut on the first 5 frets, just pressing down the strings by the nut will change the pitch of them. That's just a natural problem with a guitar. On one of my guitars, that's the exact problem, where if I'm playing a melody against something else, say I'm playing a melody against a concert pitch played on a synthesizer, which is an exact pitch, playing an E on the keyboard would be out of tune with the E that I play on the guitar. and then I would have to retune it so that those two things match, even if it's out of tune with the adjacent strings. So guitars in many ways are not only chordal, they're very linear. And if you're using a linear structure, including playing two-note chords on adjacent strings, you're going to find things that could be out of tune if you listen to them in isolation. So if you recorded them and then just soloed those two tracks, they would be extremely out of tune. And I've noticed this with harmonics played on the bass, where the harmonic does not match what's played on the keyboard. I think it's just a natural side effect of equal temperament, where harmonics will be out of tune played in context with other harmonics. So the more instruments you have, the more that's going to be masked. But when you listen to things at a low volume in isolation, then you see those little tuning defects. But anyway, I digress. I think it's quite interesting, and it's very useful to be able to play dyads from triads